Morning, folks, and welcome back to the IGES mid-year briefing. We appreciate you returning from break, and we hope that many of you got to enjoy what was the keynote address by Senior Advisor out of OJP Department of Justice, Phelan Wyrick. If you were able to join us, you were aware that he shared with us the administration's priority and gave us some insights into what of the next steps we might be able to be engaged in. He not only understands the operational and policy implications, but more, he understands how the IGES community, coming from practitioners in public sector and private sector, can truly help and support the cause of justice reform. Our next panel is going to bring together practitioners from a couple more domains. You'll remember that yesterday we had representatives from law enforcement and from the courts. Today we have the pleasure of having representatives from corrections, parole, and probation. These names will be familiar to you, as they are not only successful members of individual domains, but they are close allies and supporters of IGES. So I'm sure that both their vidas will be familiar to you. We hope to hear of their challenges that their practitioner groups are experiencing and the subsequent priorities that they would not only like to have us understand, but potentially have us support and address. Our first panelist is Tom Herzog. Our second is Marcus Hodges. Tom is CEO, of course, of Tom Herzog Consulting, but more, he is a 32-year veteran within corrections and probation work. His public sector job was Deputy Commissioner for the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Services. And Marcus has many years of experience. I want to tell you, Marcus, that of all the titles and vitas that I read, you might have the one with the most words. That being said, you were just appointed as the Vice President of the American Parole and Probation Association. But what I like best is that you are Associate Director currently of the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency within the Office of Community Supervision and Intervention Services. So that mouthful tells us that your challenges are many, and I'm sure that the information you'll be able to share with us is extremely valuable. How we decided to sort of proceed on this path is I'm going to ask each of you just to give a very brief background of your individual experiences. Let us understand what perspective you might be providing. And then we're going to go through a handful of questions to spark the discussion and have you get to what are the heart of the issues, the heart of the matter that we truly collectively should be addressing as our priorities. So Tom, we'll start with you, and then Marcus immediately thereafter.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I want to say thank you to the IGES Institute for hosting both Marcus and I for this presentation today on a very important subject to both of us, I think, and to the board and all the participants. I've been actively participating. It was great to hear the remarks of Phelan this morning to give us an understanding of what the federal interest is and the support that's going to be coming to state and local agencies regarding justice reform. My perspective on this is that I'm a 32-year practitioner in the business. I started as an officer in a juvenile facility, worked my way up through the ranks and became deputy commissioner. Along the way, I had these unique stop-offs where I was had not only operational responsibility, but there was a time when I was a research associate. There was a time when I was twice chief information officer. So the experience that I come with is somewhat unique in that it's a blend of both operational responsibility, where I always considered myself to be an agent of change. That was my academic background, and certainly the people that I started working for early in my career fostered the necessity for change within the system, not to accept things as they were necessarily, but to try to always make things better. And I think I tried to embody that throughout my career. I tried to do that with other folks to make sure that the folks that I worked with and that I worked for understood that was important to me. Now I'm a consultant in the business after having retired as deputy commissioner 5 years ago. And now I have an even more unique perspective, and I can step back and take a look at some of the things that we did along the way. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I can even point to things that I look at now and say, those were mistakes that we made. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that today. But that's really where I'm coming from relative to being an agent of change in an era that I'm very excited about right now, because I think change is evident, and I think change is necessary, as it always is. And I'm very, very happy to be participating in this with someone as well-versed in this area as Marcus Hodges.
Thank you so much, Tom. Marcus?
Yeah, Tom, and thank y'all. I'm glad to be here. I love these conversations. I love this dialogue and the whole notion of reformation and transformation in our criminal justice system. I don't need to tell you why. If I need to tell you why, then you wouldn't be in you only be in this presentation, but I don't need to say the why. We all know the why. But it's a little bit about me. Is 25-year veteran of the Virginia Department of Corrections, where I wore many hats, starting from day one being a rehabilitation counselor at a maximum security prison, working the prison side of the house, come to community corrections where I wore hats of chief probation and parole officer. I was a line officer for a number of years. So I have a good knowledge of institutions and community corrections. I've been a regional director in Virginia. I've worked at the National Institute of Corrections. And I say all of that, not because I couldn't hold on to a job. I say that is I'm a change agent. I've been a change agent since 1991. I firmly believe that people can change. I fully believe that people can help people change. But in my maturing of being almost 30 years in the business, I also know systems can change, and systems have got to change. And we know we have to change. So whenever we can have these conversations on how we can change to produce better outcomes, equitable outcomes, I'm always going to be part of that conversation. So I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you for having me, and let's get started.
All righty then. I'm grateful to have you both here today. So first question, and I'll ask both of you to address these, but first question, fundamentally, what are the challenges historically that we are faced with today, right? I mean, I don't expect us to be able to get into all of it today because we only have a certain amount of time, but talk to us about within the justice domain, what are the top 3 or 5 challenges that you think that we continue to live with on a daily basis? And Marcus, I'll throw that to you first because you're a center screen, and then Tom, of course, your input as well.
Well, I mean, historically, it's been funding. I mean, if we just talk really about probation and parole supervision, we always had the idea, we have concepts that we want to do all these things, but at times the funding was not aligned with what we wanted to do. Whether it was a shift in program, whether it was a shift in supervision strategies, whether it was a shift in technology, community corrections historically hasn't been funded well. I say this from when I was in Virginia, it's a combined system. So a lot of our systems across this country are combined where you have probation and parole and you have prisons under a Department of Corrections. Well, if you look at their budget, most of that money is going to go where? To the institution side of the house, rightfully so. I mean, we don't want people hopping fences and creating harm. So I understand that. But we've got to find a way to equalize that funding so community corrections can benefit for better programming, better use of technology to drive supervision and do that. So one of our biggest challenges I felt on the community corrections side is funding. The second thing is change management. And Tom will talk about this a little bit. Over the years, there have been several concepts that come up. You know, I mean, we went from broken windows to this and this, and we find ourselves moving from theory to theory, but not with sound implementation. That's so the whole notion of implementation science is really important to make sure that we implement these programs with fidelity to produce great outcomes. But what we do is we don't. I can remember when I was a line officer, and the big word was out of Colorado was ISP, intensive supervision. And everybody went to ISP, and ISP was going to transform corrections, community corrections, and the way we supervise. Well, I look back and I look at how we implemented and what we did. I question, did we do more harm than good by moving to a theory, not really implementing it well, not sticking to the science, just seeing a bunch of people and a bunch of contacts and doing this heavy surveillance work? So for me, funding, implementation science, change management, and whole notion of succession planning is huge. We are gray in business. As you look at my hair, I have none. But I mean, I don't know how many years I have left in doing this work. And I want to make sure that the people that I'm in charge with, that they're ready to lead in the future. Because what the future looks like for community corrections, what the future looks like for corrections is very differently what it looks like now. So succession planning is huge for us to educate, train, and get this next group of leaders to continue to move this system, because we're not going to fix it overnight. It didn't come overnight. So we need to continue to just move and let the ball continue to move down the field. Tom.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all the things that Marcus said, but I'll add to that just a couple of things, because when I certainly was in my job as Deputy Commissioner of Community Supervision, I was often arguing, by the way, that I thought we should be more funded than the institutional corrections piece. So I can totally appreciate that. But I'm going to tell you now, first and foremost, on every secretary commissioner's list, top number one, staffing. Recruiting people who can do this work, who want to do this work in the manner in which we would like it to be done. There's a change afoot. There's a nature of change around our industry that suggests we need to be recruiting people who are different than the people we have recruited in the past, perhaps, and that there might be ways to get at issues that are fundamental to the kind of change that we want to execute. So staffing is big for every commissioner. They want to keep who they have. So recruitment, retention, and training are big things always in this industry. I'll add to that also, these are things that get in the way of change, and the intractability of institutional organizations is problematic. The culture of organizations and all those things Marcus talked about, all these change efforts that we've all been through, whether it's ISP or it's evidence-based practice, all of these things come from a science base, right? These are important things at the time, but sometimes that science might lead us down the wrong path. I think it's important for us to understand how to take the best of what's available now and to put it into play. I think you do need money to do that. You need good information systems to facilitate good decision making. If we're making decisions off of bad data, then we're making bad decisions. If we don't have good operational systems that are designed to tell us what's going on, then we have a problem. A lot of our systems were created in the 1970s in these large correctional systems and probation and parole systems. The need for modern data systems that allow us to make good, intelligent decisions is paramount.
Right. So those are our historical challenges. Are there any unique barriers that are evident and challenging us today that either or both of you are sort of addressing at the moment? Is it the pandemic? Is it the administration change? Is it that cultural change that doesn't go away? What are today's concerns?
Hey, that's a great follow-up question, because the good news is this is bipartisan. I mean, and so you whether you have a liberal view or you have a conservative view, we all know we need justice transformation. And I always use the word transformation for then reform, because it needs to be transformed to produce better outcomes. So I'm a believer in that. So the good news is, at times, this is not as political as other things have been. And me being in Washington, D.C., that's welcoming that it's not. I tell you what, the COVID-19 pandemic was probably instrumental in this change. And I'll say it this way. Up until the pandemic, we were all doing trying to transform, trying to change. And you look at the George Floyd incident that echoed that. But I always tell people, transformation in our system didn't start just with George Floyd. I mean, it's been going. That was just a tipping point, to use Malcolm Gladwell's work. So what has happened when the pandemic came, and this agencies had to move, and they had to shift the way they move and to do it fast. There was no excuses. You had to move because of the pandemic, which showed me that systems can change, and systems can change at a pace, at a speed that we've never seen before. So we use the whole thing about evidence-based practice, and people say, Marcus, it takes time. And I do agree, it does take time, but it doesn't take 20 years, because if we're able to fundamentally shift how we supervise and how we do this work within a matter of weeks and months for some agencies, oh man, we can really transform this system with a sense of urgency that is needed to get to the outcome. So politics aside, I think politics are favorable for us. I think that COVID-19 pandemic has shown agencies that we can change and we can transform. We just got to keep momentum.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when change is imperative, as in with the pandemic, and that's change of processes throughout the entire justice system for all different reasons, and frankly, just the way we all lived, it happens. So yes, I think that we could push the button quicker. It's just, how do we enforce the ongoing processes to sustain that change when that does happen?
Yeah, I'd like to talk to that issue just a little bit. I think there's some of the things, and Marcus is right about the speed with which we were able to change during the pandemic. From chaos comes opportunity, right? And leaders were forced to actually take on challenges they heretofore they had always kicked the can down the road on certain things. But now the pandemic, among other things, required us to change. There's other things that are working afoot though too. The fact that video is ubiquitous now in culture, and the fact that we now have viewability into the actions of anybody, quite frankly, just about everybody can be an on-the-spot reporter these days because they're all carrying a cell phone and they're posting their videos up near immediately. So what does that speak to? It speaks to the power of individuals and the power of the technology to help promote awareness and change. It speaks to the issue of requiring us to be more accountable. It speaks to the issue of requiring us to be more transparent. To your point, Maria, I think the things that will help us to assimilate change better and to sustain these things for a longer period of time are the fact that we need systems in place that are designed to harness the power of these change opportunities, right? These are catalysts. So we need systems around accountability. We need systems around transparency, and we need good measures to help us determine where we stand and how we're doing. Those things can be dashboards, they can be report cards, but they got to be based on good, sound, fundamental information. And that information isn't necessarily just from data reported by supervisory staff. Let's talk about data that's being reported by people who are incarcerated, data being reported by people who are under supervision. Let's start collecting information from people who are actually being the ones for whom we're delivering services to. And on top of that, I would say the community. Let's create opportunities for community input that give them clear channel gateways into these large institutions that are difficult to change. And let's create a system that allows us to do all that extemporaneously.
And that reference to the clients and the community is part of that change management process, I'm sure.
Yeah, because I want to add to that. I mean, and that's what we did. Tom, you are so right. I mean, we had to move to a digital world where we use FaceTime, WhatsApp, and everything else, but we had to study it. I mean, so we're making these shifts in supervision, but now we had to examine and study it. So we did several studies, and we actually used these things what we call pulse surveys, where we give pulse surveys to our clients and to see how this virtual thing was going. What we discovered is this: our contacts during COVID-19 exceeded contacts any other year because of the virtual component. Exceeded, I'm talking about doubled and tripled. So when we talked to offenders under supervision, their feedback was they felt safer. We saw that the contacts were longer because they weren't sitting in a lobby looking over their shoulder who's next. They didn't feel it was a cattle call that the next person's next, check the box, supervision, and be out. So rapport was better. We built more relationships. So we started putting out pulse surveys just to see how this technology moved to supervision, how was it impacting supervision overall, and overwhelmingly was positive. So how you keep momentum going is you make the change. We surveyed it, we shared the data to everybody, every stakeholder, and we continue to do that now as we are continuing to move. And I'll lastly say this: when people say I can't wait to go back to normal, I don't like it. I get upset. We're not going back to normal. We're not going back to normal. We are going to move. We'll take our steps. We will survey. We will use the data to drive decisions, and we'll just keep it moving.
Well, and it's interesting, Marcus, because I was going to ask you, does that continue today? Now that the world is opening up, people are now inoculated, they've gotten their vaccines, et cetera. I was going to ask you, are you still implementing and using those processes with the remote connectivity, with the apps, et cetera?
Yes, I am. We're still using them, and we use them across all risk levels, because what we did was communication is always a barrier in supervision at times, and we've actually closed the lane. So we still use a virtual component. There's not a program that we don't have available that is not done virtually. And what we discovered, imagine this: attendance is a lot better because they can do it where they sit. So they don't have transportation issues. They don't have childcare issues because they can do it where they sit. So we will continue with this model. We probably move more toward a hybrid model, but we will continue to use all the advantages that we've gained during the COVID-19 pandemic to do supervision.
Wonderful. Okay, another question for you both. Are there examples in corrections, community supervision, in courts that you see as promising initiatives that could be umbrellaed in this reform movement?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'll start. I mean, within the corrections realm, I mean, let's be realistic. A lot of change in corrections, the institutional side, clearly comes by way of litigation. There's other change agents within corrections. There's obviously charismatic, thoughtful leaders. There's good academic input and those things. But a lot of times change comes by way of litigation. And some of the things that are happening within the corrections realm right now, and this was coming for a number of years, was the whole issue around isolation of individuals. So people who are in an incarcerated setting, whether it be a jail setting or a prison setting, who are placed in isolation, usually for behavioral reasons. The whole issue of separation and isolation are two entirely different things. But what has happened is that people have learned that there are ways to do this better. There's ways to do it for, just like the idea of shorter sentences and fewer sentences. Guess what? When you are in an incarcerated setting, there's really no reason for you to be held in a isolated situation or even a separated situation for extensive periods of time. It's deleterious to the person. Psychology is bad. Clearly, the ability to make sure that prisons and jails are safe is one thing, but disconnecting people in their entirety from social skills and social interactions is not a good thing. So what has happened? We've seen the development of things like wireless services in an environment, by the way, 5 years ago where there was no wireless services. So individuals can stay connected not only to their family members, but they can also stay connected to programmatic opportunities, education, substance abuse services, cognitive behavioral therapy services. This can all be done virtually. It can all be done across wireless barriers so that individuals are no longer completely isolated from an experience that other people get to enjoy. And so we're seeing that happen. The other thing that we're seeing, Maria, and I think this is important too, is much like happened in the community, corrections is starting to embrace the use of body-worn cameras, and with great necessity. In an industry that's been relying upon fixed-base camera assets for decades, they're now starting to understand the power of having body-worn cameras. And New York, California, and Florida have all moved forward in this direction. California was forced to go by way of the courts. New York did it as an executive leadership change, and so did Florida. And I see more of this coming, an opportunity for this to happen going forward. And I think that's going to do a great deal to help promote transparency and accountability within that area.
Yeah, and I would add to that a couple things. I know if you look at Colette Peters, director in Oregon, Harold Clark in Virginia, and several other DLC, Department of Corrections leaders, the whole notion of utilizing technology in institutions has been something that it's been tricky, and a lot of people were opposed to it greatly for security concerns. But they found a way to do it because they know that that connection is real. Reentry, it really aids in reentry. So all these thought leaders are now thinking about corrections differently. We used to have segregation, now it's admin seg, and now you see corrections across the country who are doing away with that because they found a better, more equitable, more hopeful way to do things. So I think if we continue to do on that path, it is very exciting. That's number one. On the community corrections side of the house, you look at the states of Georgia and you look at the states of Virginia who've passed legislation that looks at probation terms. It greatly reduced probation terms. So people are not sitting on probation for 8 to 10 years. They greatly reduce technical violations, things that we've been talking about for a long time. It has been passed legislation in Georgia and in Virginia and probably in other parts of the country. So this whole notion of reform and transformation is really got buy-in from everyone. And you see if there's not a state that has not passed a bill as it relates to justice reform. But the thing that I'm really encouraged about are really the reduction of technical violations, but also this whole notion now, everybody knows about probation conditions. And if you don't, well, normally when you're placed on supervision, there's a list of conditions that you must adhere to. And some are 8, some are 12, some are 20. And if the courts add special conditions, it can be more than that. Well, because you have so many of those conditions, it allows the utilization of, technical violations can occur because at any given time, I can get a technical violation on one of those conditions. There's a move afoot now to really greatly reduce those conditions. and reducing those conditions outcome, there would be a drastic reduction in technical violations, meaning a drastic reduction in those people going back to prison or in jail on just a technical violation. So those are the things that have already started, have gained a lot of momentum. States are passing bills, and it's very encouraging of how we're going to transform the system because people are getting it done.
I couldn't agree more.
It strikes me that the examples that you're both providing are excellent case studies that then should be socialized and presented and serve as training and education to your peers or to practitioner peers nationally, because coming from any other state that has not yet addressed these components, they want to hear how you did it. To not have started on that mountain themselves, they're thinking it's daunting. They're going to need everybody and their mother at the table. They're going to need to figure out a framework. They're going to need to figure out what the goals are, despite the fact that they actually want to see progress. These type of case studies, if we could actually create some snippets or utilize a focused venue so that these stories can be told, I think would be of great value to the broader practitioner community.
Yeah, I would agree. Just to put a shameless plug in for APPA, there's going to be a presentation at the upcoming APPA in August in Boston about the Georgia experience. And not only did they do things legislatively, they were ahead of the curve from a proactive standpoint relative to technology. Right? They did it with bricks and mortar offices years ago. Their staff are completely mobile. They use body cameras now to effectively determine the efficacy of the supervision process. That's amazing. The fact that they're using video footage to determine how well they're enforcing evidence-based practices, that is a game-changing approach. We're going to talk about that at APPA in Boston. So I would gladly, certainly encourage everyone to go.
Absolutely. And actually, Tom, that's even a good example of the cross-partnership sharing, right? We need to figure out a way to cross-pollinate and maybe even connect to them in different ways. But this is all great after-action stuff. In our prep call, we chatted about diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we address those priorities? How do we address those needs and balance that with getting the job done, right? It's a goal. It's something we need to do. This is the opportunity. This is the time. But how do we balance that with the budgetary concerns, with the implementation challenges, with reality? And I throw that to either one of you. Marcus, you want to start?
Yes, because that is a great question. Everything I do as a leader in this agency, I use with that lens, that DEI lens. And I have to. Every group that we do, every piece of thing we put together, all my data, everything is used in that lens. I'll go back to my Virginia experience, and I can tell you there are times when people of color, I mean, this is no secret to anybody, on a probation violation, if everything was consistent, people of color were probably getting, they were getting more time for the same charge than others. So you look at the data and you pull the data, and then you have to show it and you have the conversation with people about it. And it is the most uncomfortable conversation to have with judges, commonwealth attorneys, even your own staff, of who they're violating. But what I discovered, and Director Clark has been instrumental in Virginia in doing this, is this whole notion of dialogue is starting to have the conversation. You know, everybody talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what they do is they hire a chief diversity officer and they say, oh, our problem is solved. Well, it doesn't solve the problem. It only exacerbates the problem. The problem comes by having really uncomfortable conversations. Use your data to have the conversations, and then come up with action plans to how to fix it. I mean, so for me, it really starts with the whole notion of dialogue, looking at the data, and use that lens in everything that we do. Who you're violating, who you put on probation, are interventions and treatment equitable for everyone, really looking at your population, looking at your staff. Does your staff that you simply hire represent your community? And if you can't say yes to that, then you need to start looking in-house. So everything I do as a leader, I try to do with that lens as it affects staff, it affects those under supervision, and really try to use that lens to guide conversations, to have real conversations that produce equitable outcomes.
Yeah, that's great to hear from a leader in the industry. I wish we could hear it from more. Having worked a good amount of time in the corrections environments and having worked in institutions, I will tell you, that these are principles that don't come easy to that industry for a lot of different reasons. But it doesn't mean that the challenge is not worth taking on. It clearly is. The idea of introducing the concept of civil dialogue and civil discussion, the fact that there are things that exist within those environments routinely that promote microaggression, and an understanding of what we need to do to shift that dialogue into a more civil term. I think that goes back to who we recruit. I think it goes back to how we recruit. It clearly goes back to how we train, and it clearly goes back to how we evaluate. And I think if we do those things thoughtfully, carefully, with solid leadership, people at the top like Marcus understanding that and promoting within our organizations that these are the lenses within which we have to view everything that we do. Our own accountability, the accountability of our dialogue with others, and the accountability, quite frankly, of the people who sit next to us in our workspaces.
I would add this to the cultural shift list, because this is a manner of thinking, a perspective, a view that we all need to inculcate in our processes.
Yeah, and honestly, Maria, the thing that I see is the idea of actually institutionalizing these into early learning centers, right? And creating opportunities within our basic education realm that teaches these principles. Because if you're not getting it at home, you're not going to get it anywhere else. I think it's important that we understand that. It's important that we do that with our youth so that they understand the necessity of social justice and what are the elements of social justice. Clearly, DEI is an element of social justice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think from an organizational culture shift, that's important. And that's why people call them communities of practice. Some people call them learning teams, where you create this connect peer to purpose, where you can have honest conversation, honest dialogue that's driven by the data, but also gets to the values, thoughts, and beliefs that people hold. And that's basically what organizational culture is: value, thoughts that people hold within the organization. So if you want to shift your culture, you got to have these real, honest conversations. And the best way to do it is learning teams that we have here at CSOSA, or communities of practice, where you're just connecting peers to purpose, having real conversations.
Wonderful. So talk to me, and this wasn't on our list of items, but I think you'll both like this one, is talk to me, how do we address the inconsistency in sentencing guidelines?
Yeah, that's huge.
I know, I figured that.
Great question. Go ahead, Tom. I'll follow you.
No, I've lived through so much sentencing reform in my time. I've actually participated in some of it as well. I will tell you that it's a very complex undertaking, but that I think here's what I think. Here's what my experience tells me this: we need to simplify. We need to get to a better understanding of what the sentencing process is supposed to be. What are we doing here? I mean, what is the necessity for? Do we need to incarcerate as many people as we do in the United States? All the data suggests otherwise, right? Since I was an undergraduate in the early 1980s, I've been reading about how the United States leads the world in its use of incarceration. When I've been on international panels to have that conversation, people ask me all the time, why do you guys do that? And honestly, the only answer I can come up with is because we can. And I think it's a resource that's been overutilized because we have the ability to utilize it. ABT wrote a study in the 1980s that said, if you build cells, you will fill cells. It's an inexorable conclusion. I think when you talk about changing sentencing, I think you have to get to the resolute issue of what do we want to achieve in the justice system? Is equity and fairness as important as things like incapacitation and punishment and retribution? We need to get around these core issues and get to what's most important. Let's face it, the only people who need to be incarcerated are people who are a potential harm to other people. That's the most fundamental element. We shouldn't be sentencing people because we're mad at them. We certainly shouldn't be sentencing them because we're frustrated with their behavior. We should be sentencing people based on the need for continued care and then make a determination about where that care is best provided. And I think if we get to those core issues and try to simplify it, I think we can get to a better understanding of why we have these complex myriad of sentencing systems. And believe me, New York is probably the worst you've ever seen.
Closely followed by Jersey, but I'm with you.
Yeah, sentencing's tough. I mean, I have always been there. I shock people when I tell you this. You need guidelines. If you don't have guidelines, oh my God, you're all over the place. What happened is sentencing is not a simple process. It's a complex process, especially when you bring in plea bargaining and everything else. And you look at who's charged, and you're getting overcharged, and you charge down, and all those things. So it is a very complex issue that's really subjected to me as a prosecutor of what I'm going to charge and what a defense attorney wants to plead down to. So you have these guidelines that exist that we need the guidelines, but at the time the guidelines go into effect, there are 50 million things that happen before you get to that guideline. I mean, which makes it unfair at times, less equitable, inconsistent across the board. And that whole process probably needs to be transformed. But with all the mirrors and things under criminal justice reform, that's on the plate. I don't think that's a thing that we're started to do yet. I know states are looking at it and they're examining it, but there is a lot of moving parts when you talk about just sentencing reform.
Agreed. And actually that leads well into the next question, Marcus. So what do you think is viable to accomplish within the next 5 years? Like if we fast forwarded, what do you think that we could reasonably have accomplished at that time?
Oh, I think we can reasonably accomplish a more just, more equitable system. Just by the work we're doing now, looking at technical violations, looking at probation conditions and things like that. I think now is the time that we will see 5 years from now a more hopeful, smaller, less punitive, more equitable, restorative system. The steps we've already taken, the steps to gain those things. But I will tell you, reform is, why is this a national push? Reform is really local. And it's on local leaders to recognize the need to reform, because that's where true transformation happens. It's going to happen locally. I'm glad that we're getting the national exposure. I'm glad that it is bipartisan, but true change starts locally. And it's those local leaders in criminal justice, and really it's big in the criminal justice, local leaders in local systems getting together of how we are going to transform this system to make this community better. Because then you got to add education, you got to add social services. People talk about criminal justice reform and they get short-sighted, just think it's about criminal justice. No, it's about social services, it's about education, it's about all these other entities, it's about employment. So getting these people in the room that have conversations, and we've seen this happen. I remember when I was at NIC, the whole notion of reentry. And a model was created, transition from a prison to community model. And the semblance of that model was the community, the jobs. That's what I just talked about, getting together and saying, how can we fix this community? How can we fix our system? All of us working together. So you have these reentry councils that are all across the country that are happening locally, doing just that. But here's the thing, they need funding.
Right. And I was just going to say, there is a connection to the federal partners, because sometimes they enable funding. That's not the be all end all, but it certainly facilitates from a state and local level.
Yes. And when we see these reentry councils work well, is when all those local partners are at the table, properly funded, and the system moves.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Marcus said. I'd add to that, I think a significant drop in the use of incarceration as our first place to go. That means both prisons and jails. I'd like to see fewer and shorter sentences. I'd like to see that in 5 years. I'd like to see a significant lessening of our use of confinement, period. I'd honestly like to see the eradication of cash bail everywhere. I think it should be a national initiative. I don't think it should exist. I don't think anyone's freedom in the community should be based on their ability to pay. Yes. I just think it's so remarkably inequitable. I think we need to rethink police and courts and corrections, that traditional, the pillars of the system, because they're not disconnected entities, yet we behave like we are. We have different systems, we have different funding mechanisms, we have different data. The idea of what the justice system should stand for, Chuck Ramsey, who was the former police chief of DC and Philadelphia, he was on President Obama's task force on reinventing policing. The stuff that they said about reinventing policing applies to the rest of the system. We should fundamentally change the idea of what we're doing within the system to understand that our job as people in this system is to make sure that the rights of the individuals are protected. Your human rights, your constitutional rights, those are things that we're supposed to be protecting. It's not about administering punishment. It's not about enforcing laws or making communities safer in that sense. If we do that at the expense of ensuring the rights of people, then we've actually failed everybody. So I think 5 years from now, I'd like to see a system that promotes the idea of human rights and civil rights as a much higher attainable thing. Last piece, and Marcus said this so eloquently, it's all local. The communities that we work with have to have input into what we're doing. I would like to see 5 years from now a system that allows for the regular transfer of information from communities who are being served and underserved, quite frankly, directly to people that can make a difference, whether that's people running institutions or political leaders, folks who are actually responsible for ensuring that the interests of the citizens are maintained. Those are the people who need this information. They need it really quickly. The idea of having citizen portals and opportunities for engagement, I think 5 years from now, if we can do those things, we've fundamentally changed public safety for the better.
So deliberately or otherwise, you tripped right into my next question, Tom, with how can technology enable some of these reforms that we think may be at the top of the list?
Yeah, I think more opportunity now than probably we've ever had, right? The opportunity to utilize and harness technologies that heretofore didn't exist, or if they existed, we were reticent to use them. The idea of understanding and how to harness unstructured data, things like body cameras, things like unstructured data elements that come in from citizen portals, the opportunity for us to engage with people about how are you feeling, what are you doing, the opportunity to use cell phones, right, as a mechanism to start collecting information from people who we're supposed to be serving. Let them come to us through a ubiquitous method that doesn't require them to walk all the way down to an office to tell us something. That's insane. I'll go back to the idea when we used to use kiosks, right? We used to have people go into kiosks and they'd come all the way into the office to punch information into a kiosk. I was like, that's ridiculous. I mean, the fact that this poor individual has to get on a subway, take 2 buses, and miss an appointment at their kid's school because they got to put information into a kiosk. That makes no sense at all. The opportunity is there for technology. And I think the administration of that technology is important too. The advent of applied mathematics, right? Whether that be through artificial intelligence or machine learning, and constructed models that take into account the necessity for integrity of the process and the ability to make sure that we're making good fundamental decisions, right? So there are opportunities for us to harness applied mathematics. The presentations on yesterday on data graphics, phenomenal, right? This opportunity now for us to grab data in these large mega gobs and to put it into a repository that allows us to make good decisions. I can't argue that point. But I think it's our responsibility to take these opportunities that are available to us now, to apply them correctly, and to make sure we're working with companies that have integrity, right? To make sure that they have boards of ethics and that they're following things that are ethical in mind and in practice. And I think those are things that we need to be mindful of.
Yes, I'm gonna jump into that because Tom, you hit on a couple of things I love. I want technology beyond GPS. And so everyone will say this, oh, you community corrections, you got GPS, you're in technology. Just because you have GPS doesn't mean you're in technology. And I am a technology guru, not a guru. I want technology in supervision. What do I mean? I want it all. I want smartwatches. I want devices that people can see. Tom is right on. We just tell people to get a kiosk. We tell you to leave your house, cross town, take 4 buses to punch in a kiosk, and we say that's effective supervision. They can do that at home. And I'm going to tell you something else with the unstructured data. Now, y'all going to think I'm really spacey out there. I really think we can predict crime. There is so much untapped, unstructured data that goes in the supervision process that whenever a crime has occurred, and I go back, and I know, Tom, you've seen this when you said, there is 50 million red flags that have happened before that person committed that crime. I haven't missed one case where a red flag didn't pop up, that if we maybe would have better intervened with that red flag, maybe that crime would not have occurred. Maybe that offense may not have occurred because of all the red flags. So how can we use this unstructured data that we get on a day-to-day basis using algorithms to try to predict human behavior? I think we can do it. Our utilization of social media is outstanding right now, especially in a city that's very violent. We have over 101 homicides here in Washington, D.C. Well, we would determine from an intelligence standpoint that no one does anything and don't keep quiet about it. I mean, it's all over social media. So we use social media tools to assist MPD in suspects and everything else. So our utilization of technology it's going to be instrumental for us in 5 years, and really should really transform the supervision process to produce better outcomes that we're all hoping for.
Very cool. So first of all, I love your passion. I love your energy, gentlemen. This is phenomenal. Now, I know we're up against the hour and we could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to give us some parting thoughts, recommendations, priorities that you think would be most advantageous to the reform effort. So Marcus, you're at center screen right now, so go for it.
I use 2 words. I say we got to be bold. And being bold means we have to think not outside the box, past the box. I think we got to find creative ways to produce the outcomes that we all try to want in criminal justice. And that's less victims, safer communities, and fewer victims. That's what we want. But we can do that in a way that's equitable. We can do that in a way that's restorative, and we can do it in a way that's more hopeful. I mean, so when people are talking about transformation, it's going to take everybody involved in this process, not just practitioners. It's going to take people who in the technology field. It's going to take a group effort for us to lift the transformative system. And there is no one way. So in the ideas of to be bold, I mean, I had people present to me about the utilization of social media about 5 years ago. And I'm like, oh my God, this is I don't know. But at the end of the day, look where we're at now. We're using social media all the time right now. The whole notion of unstructured data and what we get every day. 5 years ago, people said, but Marcus, Big Brother's watching. Well, guess what? Big Brother's always watching. How can we use this data to really produce better outcomes? Mm-hmm. So all I ask people to do is in this reform process, let's be bold, let's be daring, because if we do that, it's going to lead to a total transformation that all of us can be happy about.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I'd add to that to be brave and be tough, because I think it's important to stand your ground when it comes to change. Those of us who've always been advocating for change in particularly the justice system, oftentimes receive an awful lot of pushback from other people in our industry. And sometimes that pushback comes from legislative bodies as well. I think it's important to speak truth to power. I think it's important for us to advocate at the top of our lungs the fact that these are necessary changes. It's important for us to move the dialogue forward. It's also important for us to control the narrative, right? Because I think a lot of what is happening around this particular topic is that reform is oftentimes being wrapped in the same blanket as unsafe. And that's just not true. And I think it's very important for us to be able to have the brave, courageous approach and leadership that says, no, that's wrong. We can do this responsibly. I agree with Marcus 100%. You can do it more equitably. You can do it with more involvement of people who heretofore have been uninvolved. And that's the way to go forward. And we should do it with boldness, braveness, and courage.
I love it. Thank you both, gentlemen. I definitely will, the IDIS Institute, the IDIS community will definitely recruit you in the future to support this effort. So please stay tuned. And for those that are in the audience, I'm sure that you found this as informative and vital as I did. I would ask that you join us once again at 12:30 when we're going to have Senator Camara Bartolotta from Pennsylvania State. She will be sharing her experiences and some of the initiatives that they are now addressing with regard to reform. So thank you all very much, and we will see you at